G'day guys and welcome to this business management lesson. In today's lesson we're looking at key knowledge point 329. That is unit 3, area of study 2 and the 9th key knowledge point for this area of study. Today specifically we're looking at awards and agreements of methods of determining wages and conditions of work. Now, employment entitlements is the name of the game. When an employee starts their job with a new employer, they'll typically be asked to sign a contract. That contract might include details such as the rate of pay that they'll receive or their annual salary, the amount of leave that they'll accrue and have access to over their period of employment, the hours that they're expected to work, access to parental leave, and any other employment conditions or entitlements that need to be addressed. The nature of awards and agreements is that these are documents that stipulate the minimum entitlements for employees in different circumstances. There are several different documents that outline the minimums. We start with the National Employment Standards, which are established or were established in 2009 in the Fair Work Act 2009. At the time they were established, there was a different number of entitlements than there are today, and they describe slightly different things. These have been updated over time, and as it stands today, there are 11 standards in the National Employment Standards. These apply to all employees in Australia. A great many of them to do with the minimum access to annual leave for an employee in Australia is described as being applied to a full-time employee. So for full-time employees on contracts in Australia, 4 weeks of paid leave is the legal minimum that an employer can offer an employee, and that is established in the National Employment Standards. No condition, we'll talk about awards and agreements and individual contracts in a second, but no condition or entitlement that can be offered by any employer can undercut the minimums established in the National Employment Standards. For your sakes, it is worth going to the Fair Work website and having a look at what the National Employment Standards say. This is the 11 different categories that are addressed in the National Employment Standards. But knowing what the maximum weekly hours are or what the minimum annual leave is, I just told you it's 4 weeks, but looking that up for yourself, it might change after I've published this video. So if you are watching this any longer than 24 hours after this video is first published, do check that information for yourself. Minimums around long service leave and public holidays, minimums around parental leave are all established in the National Employment Standards, and no employer, no matter how desperate they are to cut costs, can offer an employee less than the minimums established in the National Employment Standards. Now, an award is typically a document that is negotiated fiercely between employer associations and unions for a particular industry. Each industry in Australia has its own award. Some industries have more than one if there are different employment types within that industry. An example of that is teachers and support staff in education have their own awards and agreements, but pretty much every industry has at least one award. The conditions and entitlements outlined in awards can be the same as the National Employment Standards, and they can be greater or higher than the National Employment Standards. But as I've already explained, they cannot be lower than the National Employment Standards. Once unions and employer associations have come to an agreement, the proposed award details will be presented to the Fair Work Commission for them to determine if the new award proposal is fair and equitable in the current economic climate, and if it is, the Fair Work Commission will ensure that this award is certified and ratified and published, and that employers within the affected industry are complying with the new terms and conditions in that award. That's all we need to say about awards for now. Collective agreements go by several different names. Bargaining agreements, enterprise bargaining agreements, collective agreements. If you see the word agreement, typically it's referring to one of these. If the National Employment Standards apply to everyone, and an award applies to everyone within an industry, a collective agreement is for the employees of a particular business. Now, this might be an employer of thousands or tens of thousands of people. The Victorian Department of Education is an employer of staff in public schools in Victoria. There is an agreement for the teachers in the employment of the Department of Education in Victoria. Similar for nurses within the Department of Health. Similar for employees in Victoria Police. These are employers of huge numbers of employees, but much smaller employers, much smaller businesses can also have collective agreements for their employees. In the same way that awards can't undercut the minimum entitlements in the National Employment Standards, an agreement can't undercut the entitlements in the National Employment Standards or the relevant award. For example, if the National Employment Standards say 4 weeks of paid annual leave and the award says 5 weeks of paid annual leave, the agreement for your employees in your specific business can say 5 or more weeks of annual leave. You cannot undercut any of the preceding documents that establish minimums. Typically, a collective agreement is going to be negotiated between the employees and the employer with support from the relevant employer association and employee unions. But once an agreement is reached between the employer and the employees, the proposed agreement will be voted on by the employees, and if there's a majority of support there, typically that agreement is sent to the Fair Work Commission once again for the Fair Work Commission to apply what's called the BOOT, the Better Off Overall test, to determine that the conditions are fair and equitable in the current economic climate and make sure there's no sneaky exploitation occurring in this document. And then that document would come into effect and the employer would be held legally responsible for ensuring that it's now complying with the conditions as outlined in the agreement. And certainly on an individual level, employees can have individual contracts, and certainly even in a business with an agreement, individual flexibility agreements can be reached. An individual flexibility agreement is the only example of a contract that we're going to talk about in this lesson where the conditions in one of the levels might be undercut. And this might be if you find yourself in a business with an agreement, but the terms or conditions established in that agreement are actually not preferential for you for some reason, you might go to your employer and negotiate an individual flexibility agreement. Now, this can be a bit confusing, so let's look at a very simple example. This is Frank, and he has a problem. His normal hours of work are 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And Frank wants to go to a spin class. He really likes his spin classes. On the weekends, he's an enthusiastic cyclist, and he likes to maintain his fitness by participating in a spin class. That class is every Tuesday and Thursday at 5 p.m. He can't possibly be at his desk working up till 5 p.m. and also make the trip across town to his local gym to attend the spin class at 5 p.m. So what he would like to do, what he thinks would suit him better, is if he could start work at 8:30 a.m. and finish at 4:30 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, work the same number of hours, so that he can then make the trip across town and make it to his spin class. His problem is, he's working for an employer, and that employer has a collective agreement. That collective agreement says that the normal hours of work are 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and the employer must pay penalty rates to employees who work outside of those hours. Now, Frank's not going to get permission to work outside of those hours for reasons of just personal preference, because it's going to cost the business more money. And so, for Frank to get what he wants, maybe he needs to negotiate an individual flexibility agreement, which would be that he and the employer come to the agreement, come to the understanding, and they sign paperwork expressing that they've come to an understanding that Frank is going to work from 8:30 a.m. on a Tuesday and Thursday, but he won't be eligible for penalty rates because he has opted into this change. And that's why individual flexibility agreements exist in the first place. Some of your employees might prefer to be employed 0.6 or 0.8 of a full-time contract, but work 5 days a week and shorter hours so they're available for a school drop-off and pick-up for their kids. Other employees might prefer to have flexible arrangements like Frank to attend a spin class or coach their kids' soccer team or something similar. There are all sorts of reasons that people might want to work at different times or work in different ways in different locations. Perhaps one of your employees is commuting an hour and a half each way, and their preference is to work from home 2 days a week just to save them time and costs associated with that transit, and you could come to an agreement with that employee that would be otherwise outside the letter of the entitlements in the contract, in the business agreement. And certainly, you can just have individual employment contracts. Now, these are very common in businesses that might have an agreement, but if the employee is in a position where they wouldn't be subject to an agreement. So typically, your upper levels of management are not subject to the terms of an agreement. They might be on an individual contract. And it might be that this is because they're the ones who represent the employer and they're negotiating the agreement opposite the table from the employees. So it's not necessarily appropriate for them to be trying to sign off on their own wages and conditions. But typically, an individual employment contract can theoretically exist for any employee in any business. And where it does, it might build on to the terms and conditions of the agreement, assuming the agreement doesn't apply to this employee. It could establish conditions that are lower than the minimums in the collective agreement, but it couldn't ever establish conditions lower than the entitlements in the award or the national employment standards. Most commonly, individual employment contracts are used for very highly paid employees. So your CEOs, your CFOs, your COOs, they're all going to be on individual employment contracts. Your very highly valued legal consultants, your very highly valued tech consultants, if these are people who are fundamental to the operation of your business, and if they decided to go elsewhere, your business would suffer greatly. You might be looking to keep them around by offering them significantly increased remuneration, and you might use an individual employment contract to do that. In summary for this key knowledge point, the national employment standards here at the bottom outline minimum entitlements for everyone in Australia, as long as what the characteristic or the entitlement you're looking at is covered in the national employment standards. But things like minimum annual leave for every employee in Australia is covered in the national employment standards. Then you've got industry awards, which might build on the national employment standards, but will establish the minimums for the employees within a particular industry. Then a business might have an enterprise agreement or an agreement covering its own employees that might build upon the national employment standards and the award. And finally, individual employees might have contracts or flexibility agreements that may build on or vary the entitlements outlined in the preceding levels of documentation. Each of these documents is going to establish minimums for good reason. It might be that employees within a particular industry are seen as being very highly skilled and valuable, and so employers in that industry are held to reflecting how important these employees are to the greater economy. And so these employees might have minimum wages that are higher than the minimum wages outlined in other industries. Or it might be that it is reflected in an industry award that while you might have employees who don't necessarily work the standard 9 to 5 hours, because we're talking about working on an oil rig or fly-in, fly-out mine work, where the work hours might be a bit different, but those employees will have conditions in the award like increased paid leave, increased minimum wages, increased other types of leave, etc., etc. Each of these documents is legally binding, so once they're established, an employer who doesn't comply with the terms and conditions in these documents can face prosecution and penalty as a result of being found to not be compliant with this documentation. So it is very important for you as a business management student adopting the identity of a business manager to be aware of the function of these documents. And as I've already recommended, I suggest you go straight after this video and have a look at the National Employment Standards on the Fair Work website, because being able to name some of those terms and entitlements and describe them is going to be really helpful for your ability to talk about this stuff. That's all for today. See you next time.